John struggled with his coat, glancing away from his wife, Camila, as he mumbled, "I'll be home late tonight." His tone was void of the warmth it used to have. He wanted to say more, something meaningful, but every word felt hollow before he could speak it. Camila barely glanced up from her phone, her fingers moving rapidly across the screen. "Long day at work?" she asked, her voice as flat as his, her attention glued to the small, glowing screen in her hands. John paused with his hand hovering over the doorknob, wishing he could say something that might bridge the growing gap between them. But instead, he just nodded and replied, "Yeah," matching her detached tone. He stood there for a moment longer, hoping she'd look up, but she continued scrolling. Their 16-year-old son, Ethan, looked up from the kitchen table, where he was hunched over his math homework, observing his father with a mix of curiosity and unease, sensing the unspoken tension in the room. John noticed Ethan's gaze and managed a faint smile. "You doing okay with that math?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Ethan shrugged, "It's fine. Geometry's kind of tough. Though, yeah, it was hard for me too," John replied, but his voice faded. He didn't have much to offer tonight. He wanted to sit down and help Ethan with the challenging parts, but a heavy sense of unease weighed on him. He caught Camila's reflection in the window, her face still fixed on her phone, her expression indifferent. The air in the room felt unusually cold, carrying an unspoken tension that no one wanted to confront. As John opened the door, he glanced back one last time, but Camila didn't even lift her gaze. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him, feeling the weight on his chest grow as he walked to his car. The drive to work was quiet, the engine's hum filling an almost oppressive silence. John's thoughts drifted to a time when he and Camila couldn't stop talking, when every moment was filled with laughter, inside jokes, and shared dreams. Now, their conversations barely went beyond logistics, like he was living with a stranger. His phone buzzed with a notification, and he saw it was from Ethan, a simple message, "Hey, Dad, drive safe." John managed a small smile, feeling a brief warmth. Ethan was a good kid, the one thing keeping him grounded lately. He typed back quickly, "Thanks, bud, will do," before slipping his phone back into his pocket. His mind lingered on how distant Camila had become over the past months. She was always preoccupied, and whenever he tried to discuss it, she dismissed his concerns, saying he was overthinking things. He wanted to believe her, but a suspicion nagged at him, one he couldn't ignore. Later that night, John sat alone in his office, staring at the paperwork scattered on his desk, but his thoughts were on Camila, drifting to odd moments that didn't make sense. One night, she'd come home late, claiming she'd been out with a friend, yet she smelled of a stranger's cologne. When he questioned her, she'd laughed it off, saying it must have been someone at the restaurant. He tried to believe her, but the scent lingered in his mind like a ghost. His phone buzzed again with a photo message from Ethan, a picture of their dog Max sprawled on the couch, looking up at the camera with soulful eyes. "Look who's waiting for you," Ethan had written. John chuckled softly, feeling some of the tension ease. "Tell him I'll be home soon," he replied. When John finally got home, the house was dark. Ethan had gone to bed, and Camila was nowhere in sight. He found her in the bedroom, reading a book, barely acknowledging him when he entered. The silence fell over them like a heavy blanket, the walls seeming to press in on him. "How was work?" she asked neutrally. "Long," he replied, kicking off his shoes and sitting on the bed's edge. "Yours," she shrugged. Busy, they sat in silence, two people sharing the same space but feeling miles apart, the only sound the turning of pages, each one making the silence feel louder. Finally, John sighed, "Camila, is everything okay with us?" He didn't know what answer he expected but felt the need to voice his concerns. Camila looked up, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" she asked, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice. "I don't know," John hesitated, gathering his thoughts. "It just feels like you're somewhere else lately, like we're not connecting anymore." Her face hardened. "You're imagining things, John. Just because we're not teenagers doesn't mean something's wrong." "I know that," he replied, frustration creeping in. "But it's more than that, Camila. We don't talk, don't spend time together. Half the time it feels like you're avoiding me." She sighed, rolling her eyes. "You're so dramatic. Just because I have other things going on doesn't mean I'm avoiding you." John felt his temper flare but forced himself to remain calm. "Other things," he echoed. "What other things are so important that they keep you from your family?" Camila set her book down, glaring at him. "I don't have to explain myself to you, John. I have my own life too. You know your own life," he said, laughing bitterly. "You make it sound like we're strangers. Is that really how you feel?" She crossed her arms, her gaze cold. Maybe I'm just tired of you constantly questioning everything I do. Maybe I want space without you breathing down my neck." Her words hit him hard, leaving him momentarily stunned. Taking a deep breath, he pushed down the anger bubbling up. "Fine," he whispered. "If that's how you feel," Camila. She didn't respond, simply picking up her book and continuing to read as if their conversation hadn't happened. John stared at her, the woman he'd once thought he'd spend his life with, feeling an icy distance he couldn't shake. The next morning, John woke up early, slipping out of bed quietly to avoid waking Camila. He found Ethan in the kitchen, already making breakfast. Ethan looked up with a hesitant smile. "Morning, Dad," he greeted. "Morning, champ," John replied, forcing a smile as he sat at the table, watching Ethan flip pancakes with surprising skill. "You all right?" Ethan asked, setting a plate in front of his father. John nodded, but he knew Ethan could see past his attempt to appear fine. "Yeah, just tired," he replied. Ethan studied him carefully. "You and Mom aren't, arguing or anything, right?" John hesitated, uncertain about how much he should reveal to his son. "No, we're not arguing, it's just things have felt a little off lately, that's all." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, replying softly, "I've noticed. It's like you both seem different." John glanced down at his plate, his appetite suddenly disappearing. He didn't know how to explain it to Ethan, and didn't want to burden him with adult concerns, yet he couldn't keep pretending. "We're working on it, Ethan," he said, trying to make the words sound more comforting than they felt. "Just give us some time." Ethan nodded, but John noticed the worry in his eyes. Reaching across the table, he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, saying softly, "No matter what happens, Ethan, I'm here for you." Always. Ethan managed a small, uncertain smile, as if he didn't fully believe it, and at that moment, John realized just how much he was already losing. Ethan came into the house, his clothes soaked from the rain, sneakers squelching on the floor. A storm had cut his baseball practice short, and he looked forward to a hot shower and possibly watching a late-night movie with his dad. As he shook off the rain from his jacket, he noticed an odd stillness in the house. It was unusually quiet. Setting his bag down by the door, he heard a faint sound from upstairs, a muffled voice. He froze, his pulse quickening. His parents never had guests over without letting him know, especially when no one was expected to be home. The faint, muffled voices continued, and as he began to move cautiously toward the stairs, his mind raced. "Is Mom okay?" he wondered. As he crept up, the voices became clearer, and he recognized his mother's laugh, soft and familiar, yet somehow different. The door to his parents' bedroom was slightly open, and he could see shadows moving inside. He saw two figures on the bed, one his mother, Camila, the other a man he didn't immediately recognize. Holding his breath, Ethan moved closer, trying to process what he was seeing without making a sound. Then it struck him like a punch to the gut. His mother was there with Matthew, his dad's best friend. Ethan's stomach twisted, his mind spinning, his fists clenching as he tried to grasp what was happening, what it meant. But there was no mistaking it. The way they were entangled left no room for doubt. His blood boiled and anger surged through him. Without thinking, he shoved the door open, startling both of them. "What the ___ is this, Mom?" Ethan shouted, his voice shaking with fury. "Get out of the house." Camila scrambled away from Matthew, pulling the covers around herself, her eyes wide with shock and fear, her face frozen. Ethan stood there, trembling, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. Matthew, however, seemed unaffected, looking at Ethan with a smug expression, a slight smirk on his face as he casually adjusted himself, almost as if Ethan's outrage amused him. "Ethan," Camila stammered. I can explain," Ethan snapped, his voice filled with disbelief. "What could you possibly say to make this okay?" He glared from his mother to Matthew, fists clenched tightly. "How could you do this, Mom? To Dad?" "To us." Camila opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked away, her face pale, unable to meet his gaze. "Get out of the house, Mom," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I'm telling Dad everything. You're sleeping with his friend behind his back. He deserves to know." Camila's head jerked up, and her face shifted from guilt to defiance. "Who do you think you are to lecture me?" She snapped harshly, a tone Ethan had never heard from her before. "Who the ___ are you to tell me what to do? You're just a kid. Stay out of this and mind your own business. I'll do whatever I want." Ethan stepped back, stung by her words. "Are you serious right now?" he demanded. "You're telling me to stay out of this? This is my family." Camila crossed her arms, her face hardening. "You don't understand adult relationships, Ethan. There are things you just can't comprehend." Things I can't comprehend, Ethan echoed sarcastically. What's there to understand, Mom? You're cheating on Dad with his best friend Matthew, lounging on the bed, let out a low chuckle, as if the entire scene amused him. He leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head and said, "Hey dude, get out. You heard your mom." "This isn't your business." The casual way Matthew spoke sent a fresh surge of anger through Ethan. Glaring at him, fists still tight at his sides, he replied, "Don't you dare talk to me like that. You have no right to be here." Matthew raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Your dad's not here, but I am, and that's all that matters right now." He smirked, adding, "Why don't you just leave? Let the adults handle this. Can't you see I'm busy with your mom?" Ethan's hands shook as he fought the urge to punch him. Turning his glare back to his mother, he said, "This is disgusting, Mom. I can't believe you do this. Do you even care about Dad anymore?" Camila's face softened briefly, guilt flickering in her eyes, but she quickly masked it, standing tall and crossing her arms again. "You'll understand one day, Ethan. Marriage isn't always perfect, so that's it." Ethan's voice was cold. "You just throw everything away because it's not perfect. Life is complicated, Ethan," she replied dismissively, as if his anger was something he'd outgrow. "It's not complicated, Mom, it's messed up," he retorted, his voice breaking slightly, hurt and anger mixing with betrayal. "You don't get to decide what's right or wrong here. Dad deserves the truth. If you tell your father," Camila warned, "you'll only make things worse. Do you want to break this family apart?" Ethan shook his head, his expression full of disbelief. "No, Mom, you're the one who broke this family. I'm just telling the truth." Turning away, he felt the weight of his decision settle on him and began to walk out. Behind him, he heard his mother calling his name, but he ignored her, already focused on what he needed to do. Outside, Ethan grabbed his phone, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through his contacts. Finding his dad's name, he paused, took a deep breath, and hit call. After a few rings, John picked up. "Hey, bud, what's up?" he asked cheerfully, sounding glad to hear from him. Ethan took a shaky breath, his voice low. "Dad, you need to come home. There's something you need to know." There was a pause on the line before John's tone turned serious. "What's going on, Ethan?" "Are you okay? Just come home, Dad," Ethan replied, his voice unsteady but holding firm. "I'll explain when you get here." John hesitated, but finally agreed. "All right, I'll be there soon. Hang tight." "Okay," Ethan ended the call, his hands still shaking. Behind him, he could faintly hear his mother's voice calling him, but he didn't look back. He opened the front door and stepped out into the rain, letting the cold drops hit his face, washing away some of the anger and confusion swirling within him. Standing on the porch, he stared out at the street, his mind racing. How had it come to this? How had his family, the people he trusted most, fallen apart so suddenly? He couldn't fully comprehend it. All he knew was that his dad deserved the truth. A few minutes later, he saw his father's car turn the corner, the headlights lighting up the driveway. As the car pulled in, Ethan felt a combination of relief and dread. John got out, his face full of concern as he hurried toward the steps. "Ethan," John said, searching his son's face. "What's going on? Are you all right?" Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Dad, there's something I found out." "About Mom and Matthew?" John's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated, but forced himself to continue. "I came home early tonight. I saw Mom with Matthew. They were..." He looked away, struggling to find the words. John's face shifted, shock and anger flashing across his features. He took a step back, as though the weight of Ethan's words had physically struck him. For a moment he just stood there, absorbing what he'd heard. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I'm sure, Dad. I saw it." John's fists clenched, his jaw tightening as he processed his son's words. He looked toward the house, his face tense with restrained anger. "Thank you for telling me, Ethan," he said quietly. I just need a moment. You okay, kid?" John's voice was strained, but Ethan nodded, his jaw set. "I'm with you, Dad. Whatever happens, I'm here." John placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze before heading into the house. Ethan followed closely, a mix of fear and determination in his heart, knowing his father was about to confront the truth. As they turned toward the house, Ethan noticed a new intensity in his father's expression. For the first time, Ethan felt a fierce protectiveness over his dad, realizing that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same. Inside, Camila was pacing the living room, wringing her hands. When she saw John, her face went pale. She opened her mouth to say something, but John's cold stare froze her in place. "So this is what it's come to, Camila," he said, his voice low, each word laden with tightly controlled fury. Camila stumbled over her words, struggling to find composure. "John, please, I can explain." John's tone turned mocking, bitterness edging his words. "Explain sneaking around with my best friend, or should I say former best friend?" His gaze shifted to Matthew, who was lounging on the couch with a smug grin, as if he had nothing to worry about. Camila took a step forward, reaching out in a desperate plea. "Please, John, let's talk about this. It's complicated." John's voice rose, his calm exterior finally cracking to reveal his anger. "Was it complicated when you promised yourself to me?" Matthew rolled his eyes, crossing his arms as he leaned back casually on the couch. "Come on, John, don't take it so seriously. It's just a bit of fun." Before either Camila or Ethan could react, John's fist shot forward, landing solidly on Matthew's jaw with a loud crack. Matthew stumbled back, clutching his face, his smug expression wiped away. He straightened, glaring at John with a mix of shock and rage. "You think you can just hit me?" he snarled, attempting to recover his composure. John stepped forward, unflinching, his eyes blazing. "It's not a matter of thinking, Matthew. I know I can." He pointed to the door. "Get out of my house." Now Matthew looked over at Camila, hoping for support, but she remained still, horrified by the unfolding scene. Ethan, standing firmly behind his father, crossed his arms and fixed his glare on Matthew. "You heard him. Get lost for a second." Matthew hesitated, then scoffed, brushing past John on his way out. "Fine," he muttered. "You'll regret this, John." "Trust me." John didn't flinch, his gaze still locked on Camila. Once the door slammed behind Matthew, a heavy silence fell over the room. Camila looked at John, a desperate plea in her eyes. "John, please." "I made a mistake." Her voice was barely a whisper. John slowly shook his head, the coldness in his expression replaced by raw hurt. "A mistake, Camila? This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice you made, over and over." Camila's voice grew frantic, her hands trembling. "John, I was lonely. You've been so distant lately, and I needed someone, so you turned to Matthew." John's voice was sharp and accusing. "My best friend? You think that justifies betraying me? Betraying our family?" Unable to stay silent any longer, Ethan stepped forward. "Mom, don't put this on Dad. He's been doing everything he can to keep this family together, and you—" He stopped, trying to keep his voice steady. "And you just threw it all away." Camila's face twisted, her defenses beginning to crumble. "Ethan, please. You don't understand. It's not as simple as it seems." "Don't try to make excuses," Ethan replied, his tone filled with disappointment. "I'm not a kid. I know what I saw." John placed a calming hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Ethan, go upstairs. I need to speak with your mother alone." Ethan hesitated, glancing between his parents. "Are you sure, Dad?" "Yes, son. I'll handle this." Reluctantly, Ethan nodded, giving his mother one last, disappointed look before heading up the stairs. Once Ethan was gone, Camila exhaled shakily. "John, please. I can fix this. We can make things right." "How?" Camila. John asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "How do you plan to fix this?" She stepped closer, reaching for his hand, but he pulled back. "We can go to counseling," she said quickly. "We can work through this. It doesn't have to be the end." John let out a bitter laugh. "You expect me to just forgive you? Pretend none of this happened?" Camila's voice cracked. "I don't want to lose you, John. I don't want to lose our family." John shook his head, his expression hardening once more. "You lost us the moment you brought Matthew into our lives like this." He let out a heavy sigh. "You made your choice, Camila. Now I'm making mine." Camila's face crumpled, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. "John, please. I love you. I made a terrible mistake, but I love you." "Love," John repeated, his voice hollow. "Is that what you call this? Destroying everything we built together?" She reached out to him again, and this time he didn't pull away, though he offered no warmth in return. "I know I messed up, but I want to make things right. We have so many years together, John. You can't just throw that away." "Funny," he replied, his tone laced with bitter amusement. "Isn't that exactly what you did?" Camila sobbed, holding his hand tightly as he finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a sorrow she'd never seen before. "Don't leave us, John. Don't walk away from me," she pleaded. He looked at her, his expression softening momentarily, but then he took a deep breath, appearing to reach a decision. "You know," he said slowly, "I spent years believing in us, in you, and you made me look like a fool." Pulling his hand away, he took a step back. "I don't want to see you here when I return," he said firmly. "Pack your things and leave." Camila's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. "John, where am I supposed to go? What about Ethan?" "You should have thought of that before," he replied, his tone final. "It's too late for regrets now." She fell silent, realizing her pleas would not sway him. Staring at him, her tear-streaked face reflected the depth of her anguish as she turned to gather her belongings. John remained in the living room, his hands in his pockets, gazing out the window into the rain. The full weight of it settled over him, years of trust shattered in an instant. He clenched his jaw, determined not to let the pain overwhelm him. He needed to stay strong, at least for Ethan. As she walked past him, suitcase in hand, she paused, casting one last glance his way. "I'm sorry, John. I truly am." He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the dark, rainy sky outside. Without another word, Camila left, the door closing with a quiet click behind her. John stood there for a long moment, letting the silence of the empty house envelop him. Eventually, he climbed the stairs and found Ethan sitting at the top, waiting. Ethan looked up, his eyes filled with questions. "She's gone," John nodded, feeling a surge of pride at the resilience in his son's gaze. "Yes, son. She's gone." They shared a silent moment, a blend of sorrow and relief settling over them. For the first time in what felt like forever, it was truly just the two of them. "What happens now, Dad?" Ethan asked softly. John placed a hand on his shoulder. "We start over, just you and me." They stood in the stillness of the house, father and son, as the storm outside finally began to calm. In the weeks after Camila's departure, John changed. The house was emptier, but a newfound strength filled the space left by betrayal. Late at night, while the world slept, John and Ethan would sit together, exchanging ideas with a shared resolve to restore their dignity. Their bond had once been simple, that of father and son, but now a new purpose brought them closer. During these quiet evenings, John spoke to Ethan as an equal, and Ethan developed a deep respect for his father he hadn't fully known before. "Dad," Ethan began one night as they sat on the porch, looking out at the quiet neighborhood, "I want to help. I can't just sit here and let her get away with this." John gave him a slight smile, nodding as he met his gaze. "I know you do, Ethan, but this isn't something you should have to carry. I'm not just a kid anymore." "Dad," Ethan replied firmly, meeting his father's eyes, "she hurt both of us. You deserve better, and I'm not going to sit back and pretend it's fine." John looked at him thoughtfully, noting the mix of anger and determination in his expression. He sighed, patting Ethan's shoulder. "All right, but if we're doing this, we have to be smart together." They spent hours crafting a plan. John wanted to make sure Camila and Matthew truly felt the consequences of what they had done. Forgiveness would not come easily. They had broken the family's trust, and John intended to make them face the repercussions. "First things first," John said, spreading out a sheet of paper on the dining table with a list of tasks. "We start by gathering information on Matthew. I want to know everything about him, his finances, his job. I want him to feel the ground fall out from beneath him." Ethan leaned in, intrigued. "I can look up stuff about him online. Maybe we'll find something useful." "Good thinking," John nodded. "A guy like him is bound to have skeletons in his closet. He's way too arrogant not to." Over the next few days, Ethan combed through Matthew's social media, digging up anything he could. Eventually, he found something: a business loan Matthew had taken out a few months ago, one with a heavy interest rate. It was a loan big enough to ruin him if his business ran into trouble. "Dad, look at this," Ethan said one evening, holding up his laptop. He borrowed a huge amount for his construction company. If things go south, he's done. John's face lit up with satisfaction. "Good work, son. We'll keep that for later. Now, let's focus on Camila." Together, they looked into Camila's recent activities. John discovered she'd used their joint account to splurge on clothes, hotel rooms, and expensive dinners. As he added each transaction to his list, his expression darkened. "She spent our money, our savings, to fund her affair," he muttered, shaking his head. "This is beyond betrayal." Ethan clenched his fists as he examined the bank statements. "How could she do this? Doesn't she feel any shame?" "Maybe at first she did," John replied, "but when you start betraying someone, lying comes easy. People start convincing themselves they're in the right." Ethan nodded, absorbing his father's words. "Then she deserves everything that's coming to her." In the days that followed, John set the first phase of his plan in motion. He withdrew half of their savings from the joint account and transferred it to an account in his name. The rest he set aside for the lawyer he'd hired to begin divorce proceedings. "I won't let her take anything else from us," he told Ethan, his voice steady with conviction. "We're going to get a fresh start. She won't have a role in our future." One evening, after weeks of silence, Camila showed up at the house, knocking softly on the door. John and Ethan exchanged a look before John gestured for Ethan to stay back while he went to answer. "John, please, I just want to talk," Camila began, her eyes red and weary. "Can I come in?" He stepped aside, letting her in, but kept his arms crossed. Ethan watched from the hallway, tense and listening intently. Camila's gaze wandered around the living room, lingering on the empty space that had once felt like home. "I miss you," she said quietly. "I made a mistake, but I don't want to lose our family." John raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because you didn't seem to mind losing us when you were out with Matthew, spending our money on whatever caught your fancy." Camila flinched, wringing her hands together. "I know, I don't deserve forgiveness. But can we at least try to work through this? For Ethan's sake." "Now you're thinking of Ethan." John's voice was sharp, slicing through her appeal. "Where was that concern when you were sneaking around? When you were spending the money I worked hard for?" She opened her mouth to protest but stopped, looking down. "I know I hurt you, John," she murmured. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. Just tell me what to do." "What you can do," John responded icily, "is sign the divorce papers. That's all I want from you now." Her face fell, but she nodded slowly, realizing the weight of what she had done. "Fine," she whispered. "If that's what you want." John held her gaze, unwavering. "And don't expect a dime from me. You made this choice, Camila. You can live with it." With nothing left to say, Camila left, her footsteps echoing through the house. Ethan watched her go, feeling his anger mingled with a strange relief. She was gone, truly gone, and they could finally begin to move on. In the weeks that followed, John and Ethan pressed on with their plan. Each time Camila tried to contact them, John remained resolute, shutting her out and rejecting her pleas. Gradually, he built his case, ensuring she would face the consequences of her betrayal in more than one way. One day, as they sat at the dining table, Ethan looked at his father with newfound admiration. "You know, Dad, I'm proud of you," he said, a slight smile crossing his face. "You're not just taking this lying down." John chuckled, ruffling Ethan's hair. "I guess you've taught me a few things too, kid. Sometimes we have to stand up for ourselves, no matter how tough it is." Their bond grew stronger every day, and as they looked toward the future, they both knew they would face it together, stronger, wiser, and free from the betrayal that once tore them apart. It was a cool, quiet evening when Camila arrived at the house. The porch light was off, and something about the darkness unsettled her. She slid her key into the lock, but it wouldn't turn. Frowning, she tried again, but the lock remained unmoving. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach as she stepped back. Glancing at the windows, the curtains were drawn, and the house seemed different. She took out her phone, scrolling through her contacts with trembling fingers. "John, please, pick up," she whispered, her voice filled with fear. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again, each time feeling her dread deepen. Her mind raced. Where was her family? Her son? Taking a shaky breath, she dialed Ethan's number. "Hey, it's Ethan. Leave a message." Camila's hands began to shake as she walked into the yard, hoping to find some sign, some clue as to what was happening. Her eyes fell on a pile of boxes by the gate, her belongings, clothes, books, framed photos, and personal items, all hastily packed and left outside. Anger flared up in her, and she pounded on the door with her fists. "John, open the door." "This is my life, my home." Her voice echoed down the empty street, sharp and desperate. A car engine revved in the driveway, and Camila turned to see John's car pulling up. He stepped out slowly, his expression unreadable as he closed the door and walked toward her. "John," she cried, rushing toward him. "What is this? Why doesn't my key work? Why are my things outside?" John stopped a few feet from her, arms crossed, regarding her with a coldness she hadn't seen before. "Why are you here, Camila?" he asked softly, his tone more chilling than if he'd shouted. "This is my home," she yelled, gesturing around. "I have a right to be here. I'm your wife." A bitter laugh escaped him as he shook his head. "A wife," he repeated. "That title lost its meaning for you the moment you chose to throw away this family for what? A cheap thrill." Camila's defiance faltered, replaced by desperation. I know I messed up, John, but we can fix this. Just let me in, and we can talk." John's expression remained unchanged. "There's nothing left to discuss. I made my decision. The house is mine now legally." He pulled a set of papers from his jacket and held them out, his eyes never leaving hers. "These are the divorce papers. I suggest you take them, sign them, and leave." "We're done." Camilla, her face crumpled as she stared at the documents. "No, John. Please don't do this," she begged, reaching out to him. "Please, let's try again." "I'll do anything." John took a step back, his expression unyielding. "It's too late, Camilla. You had a family, a life with us, and you decided to destroy it." She sank to her knees on the gravel, clutching his pant leg. "Please, John," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll change. I'll be better. Just don't leave me like this." He pulled his leg free, stepping back again. "I didn't leave you, Camilla," he replied, bitterness tinging his voice. "You left us long before tonight." Turning back toward his car, Camilla scrambled to her feet, her desperation morphing into anger. "So that's it," she yelled. "You're just going to throw me out?" "I'm your wife?" "John, no," he replied calmly. "You were my wife. The woman I married would never have done this to her family." At that moment, Ethan's car pulled up behind John's. Hope flickered in Camilla's eyes as he stepped out, and she reached toward him. "Ethan, tell your father to let me back inside. I'm still your mother." But Ethan's expression was as cold as his father's, his eyes filled with resentment and hurt. "Mom," he said, his voice steady. "What did you expect? You cheated, you lied, and you thought you could just walk back into our lives like nothing happened." "Ethan, please," Camilla pleaded, reaching for his hand. "I made a mistake, but I'm still your mother." Ethan shook his head, his face set. "No, you're not the same person anymore. I trusted you. We both did." John watched her in silence for a moment before adding, "You made this choice, Camilla. You can't expect us to forgive you just because it suits you now." Suddenly, a familiar voice broke through the tension. "What's going on here?" Matthew called as he sauntered up the driveway, glancing between the boxes, Camilla, and then John and Ethan. "Camilla, babe, what's going on?" John's expression darkened as Matthew approached, a smug grin on his face. "Perfect timing, Matthew," he muttered sarcastically. "Just in time to clean up the mess you helped create." Matthew smirked, leaning casually against his car. "Come on, John. No hard feelings, right? You weren't making her happy. What did you expect?" Before anyone could react, Ethan stepped forward, his face tight with anger, stopping inches from Matthew. "You really think you're something, don't you?" he said in a low, controlled voice. "You came into our home, disrespected my father, tore our family apart, and you think it's just a joke?" Matthew shrugged, unfazed. "Look, kid, it's nothing personal. Life's messy. Adults do what they need to do to be happy." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, and for a moment it seemed he might swing, but John placed a hand on his shoulder, pulling him back. "Matthew," John began, his voice steady, "you don't understand what loyalty means, and I doubt you ever will. But remember this: whatever pride you're feeling, whatever foundation you think you've built, it won't last. You'll end up with nothing, and it'll be exactly what you deserve." Matthew scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Spare me the lecture, John. Camilla and I are moving on, and you're just bitter." John shook his head, his face unreadable. "That's where you're wrong. I'm not bitter, I'm free." He turned, motioning for Ethan to follow, and together they walked back to the house, leaving Camilla and Matthew standing in the driveway, watching them disappear inside. As the door closed, a feeling of finality washed over John. This chapter, painful as it was, had finally closed. He turned to Ethan, who was looking at him with a mix of admiration and relief. "Are you okay, Dad?" Ethan asked softly. John nodded, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "I am now, son, and so are you. This was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was the right choice." They stood there for a moment in silence, father and son, in a house that now felt fresh, free from the shadows of betrayal that had darkened it for so long. Back outside, Camilla glanced down at the boxes by her feet, her face pale and eyes hollow. She could feel her life slipping away piece by piece, as the reality of her choices sank in. "What do we do now, Matthew?" she asked, her voice trembling. Matthew just shrugged, pulling out his phone and walking back to his car. "Figure it out, Camilla. You're a big girl." As he drove away, leaving her standing alone in the dark, Camilla realized too late that she had gambled everything for her desires and lost it all. In the empty street's silence, the weight of her choices settled heavily upon her, knowing no amount of pleading would ever bring back what she had given up. Mornings took on a different tone for John and Ethan. They went through their daily routines with a renewed sense of purpose, each day a step toward rebuilding what had once felt broken. The house was quieter, but lighter somehow, as if the very air was easier to breathe. One morning, over breakfast, Ethan looked up from his cereal, watching his dad pour coffee. "Dad," he began tentatively, "do you think things will ever feel normal again?" John paused, looking out the window thoughtfully before he replied. "Normal," he mused, then met Ethan's eyes with a gentle smile. "Maybe not the same as before, but I think we're building something stronger than that." Ethan nodded, absorbing his dad's words. He'd seen a different side of his father, someone resilient, calm, even under the strain of heartbreak and betrayal. In this new chapter, they were more of a team than they'd ever been. Months went by, and John found himself diving deeper into his work, setting fresh goals and focusing on projects he had set aside for too long. His colleagues noticed the shift, a renewed energy he brought to everything he worked on. One day, he decided to attend a local business networking event, something he would have avoided before. As he mingled with the crowd, discussing potential partnerships and new ideas, he found himself talking with Penelope, a woman in his field who shared his enthusiasm for creative ventures. She laughed at his jokes and listened attentively as he described his latest ideas. "I can't remember the last time I actually enjoyed one of these events," John admitted, glancing around the busy room, "but here I am, surprised at how much fun I'm having." Penelope laughed, nodding. "Same here. I usually duck out after the keynote, but I'm glad I stayed." There was a warmth and openness about her that John hadn't felt in years. They exchanged numbers, intending to meet again under the guise of work collaboration, but both understanding it was more than that. Her kindness and grounded nature brought a soothing comfort to wounds he thought would never heal. Meanwhile, Ethan's life was changing as well. Without the constant family tension, he was able to concentrate on school, and his grades improved noticeably. His teachers saw his engagement and his determination to succeed. One afternoon, after securing a spot on the school's debate team, he hurried home, eager to share the news. "Dad," he called as he came through the door. "Guess who's the newest member of the debate team?" John looked up from his laptop, grinning. "No way. That's amazing, Ethan." "I'm so proud of you," Ethan beamed, the pride in his father's eyes giving him a renewed confidence. They spent the next hour in the kitchen, discussing strategies for his upcoming debates and laughing over dinner. They were learning to celebrate their victories together, however small, and it gave both a new sense of hope. Across town, Camila's life looked very different. Matthew had disappeared from her life without a second thought once the thrill of their affair faded. Now she lived alone in a small apartment, barely making ends meet with a part-time job. Friends she once confided in had distanced themselves, and her family avoided her calls. Her days were filled with a hollow emptiness, regrets echoing louder in the quiet of her small, empty home. One day she saw John and Penelope together at a park. They were walking, laughing, and sharing easy conversation. Watching them from a distance, a lump formed in her throat as she took in how happy and free John seemed. Her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly turned away, unable to bear the sight. As the months turned into years, John and Penelope's relationship grew deeper. They became inseparable, sharing life's small joys from weekend hikes to cozy dinners with Ethan. One evening, Penelope joined them for a quiet dinner at home. She and John prepared the meal together in the kitchen, while Ethan set the table, a comfortable rhythm forming among them. When dinner was ready, they all sat down, laughter and conversation flowing easily around the table. Ethan looked around, noticing the warmth and contentment filling the room. It was a sense of family he hadn't felt in a long time. Watching his father's smile, he realized they'd found something precious. "You know, Penelope," Ethan said with a grin, "Dad's cooking has definitely improved since you came around." John laughed, nudging his son playfully. "Hey, I've always been an amazing chef. You two just never appreciated my genius." Penelope chuckled, rolling her eyes. "Well, I think your cooking skills are wonderful." John, as they continued their meal, a quiet understanding settled over them. They weren't just friends or dinner companions, they were a family. For the first time in a long while, John felt he was exactly where he belonged. Camila's life continued to spiral downward. The once luxurious lifestyle she enjoyed had faded into long hours at work and empty evenings in her lonely home. Most of her days were spent reflecting on the life she had given up, the family she betrayed, all for a momentary thrill. One evening she decided to call John, her hand shaking as she dialed his number. Each ring echoed in the silence until the call went to voicemail. She paused, then softly whispered, "John, it's me. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm sorry. I just wanted you to know that." She hung up, knowing that her apology couldn't change anything. The weight of her choices had settled heavily, unchangeable and final. Back at home, John and Ethan finished watching a late-night movie with Penelope. As the credits rolled, John leaned back on the couch, feeling a warmth in his heart that he hadn't felt in years. Looking at Penelope and Ethan, he felt a sense of peace and contentment. They had truly left behind the darkness that once clouded their lives. After Penelope said goodbye and left, Ethan turned to his father, a serious expression on his face. "Dad, I know it was really hard for you," he said quietly, "but I just want to say that I'm glad you found Penelope. And I'm proud of how you handled everything." John put his arm around Ethan's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you, Ethan. You were my strength through it all, you know that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm proud of you too, more than you realize." As they sat together, father and son, they felt the weight of the past finally lift, making way for a future filled with hope. It was a fresh start, built on trust, resilience, and love, and they knew that whatever challenges came, they could face them together.